Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. This is Firoz Manji on Organizing in the Times of COVID-19. Thank you for joining us today. Today I've invited Sally Kane, who's the executive director of the US-based National Federation of Community Broadcasters. She's an extraordinary woman, years of experience in community organizing, working in community radio. She's been a facilitator, fundraiser, and an impassioned public speaker. And I'm sure you will find when she talks to us today that you will also share that view. The National Federation of Community Broadcasters is one of the oldest and largest national organizations dedicated to community stations. And I'm hoping that that Sally will tell us more about the nature of public broadcasting in the US, which I think is rather different from many other places. I asked Sally to join us to give us an introduction into how people in communities, whether they are rural, low income, African American communities, indigenous communities, and so on, how they survive and live in a situation where there are huge risks faced by infection by COVID. And this is in a country which is it is the richest country in the world. It probably has the worst healthcare infrastructure, at least for the majority of Americans, as far as I understand it. And I also wanted to get an insight from Sally about how community radio can be used as a organizing medium. Especially in situations where human interactions directly are limited, and we are facing in the US a national elections, and so I would really like to be able to cover all those topics. So I want to wish a very warm welcome to you, Sally. Welcome for joining us.
Thank you, Firoz. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, Sally, it's great to see you again. And where are you based at the moment?
Well, I am working out of my basement on the western flank of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. Most of our population concentration is on the eastern side of the mountains, and they run right down the middle of our state. And I'm on the other side of the mountain. So we call it the other side of the divide.
This is the state of Colorado, and you've been living there for a long time. Were you not a midwife?
I was.
At some time in the past?
I was born here, as was my father and my grandmother and my children. So I know the Rocky Mountains very well. And in my 20s, I apprenticed myself to a rural home birth midwife and became a licensed professional midwife and worked in rural communities here in Colorado and also on the border of Mexico in El Paso. And I delivered, well, I didn't deliver, the mothers did. I caught 400 slippery babies in those years.
Goodness me. So how did you get involved in community radio? Because you used to run a community radio station locally, did you not?
I did. Community radio made its way into my life when I was just in middle school. And here in the same town where I live is the town I grew up. It's called Paonia, Colorado. And my parents bought a farm and moved here in the early 70s. And I went to the public schools and had a great high school principal who knew that my parents were part of a group helping to start a public radio station. And he allowed me to take some time in my school day to get involved with radio. So I got into the sound and feel of public radio at a young age. It was a big part of our family's life, and it stayed a part of my life from then on. And so in high school, I had a radio show and went on about my life, married, had children, did a lot of other things, including the midwifery. And when I returned for the second time to live in my home community, I volunteered at the radio station as a DJ. I love folk music, and I wanted to do a music show. And then I sort of unwittingly got onto the board. I wanted to help the station. And from that position, we decided to lead a capital campaign to renovate a new building for our radio station. It had grown from 10 watts to 8,000 watts, and from serving one little community of under 1,000 people to serving 10,000 square miles of people in this rural area. So we needed something different to operate in. And I became the general manager, then the executive director. And then currently I was recruited to run a national organization that represents these kinds of community, tribal, and university licensees within our national public media system. So community radio has been my entry into public media, and it's been a big part of my life for as long as I can remember.
That's really interesting. I mean, when in other countries, when we talk about radio and talk about public radio, we all have a sort of idea that this is, a national broadcasting, but my understanding, it's sort of different in the US, isn't it? It's
yeah. Thanks for asking the question. I often find in speaking with colleagues around the world that NPR, or National Public Radio, is understood as the BBC or the CBC of the United States. And when you're in the United States, the picture becomes a bit more complex. We love to make things a little more complex, I guess, in the United States. But how it works is that National Public Radio, or NPR, is a national, international news magazine and producer. And so they create content, and they have a vast network of radio stations around the country that choose to be members of NPR. And when they do that, they then are hooked up to a distribution system that runs by satellite and fiber optic. It's a hybrid kind of system now. And they are able to receive those primary morning magazine of Morning Edition and afternoon, All Things Considered, and the plethora of other programming that NPR produces, as well as other producers in the United States, Public Radio International and American Public Media. Those are really the three main big producers. But the point is that all of the radio stations in the public media system are actually independent of one another and of NPR. So it's their choice what kind of programs they air on their airwaves. And my particular constituency exists within the public media system. And what's the same about all of those stations is that there's no advertising, and that they rely on the support of their listeners as well as other fundraising that they're able to do. So we share that with the rest of public media. But what's different about community radio is that it tends to be most robust in communities that are historically marginalized, such as African American and Native and Latino, Asian American communities, immigrant communities, and rural America. So the way that the public radio service works in those areas is that those independent stations choose what kind of syndicated national programming they air. And then the bulk of their programming, over like 65%, and in some cases 100%, is created by the people who actually live there. who live in the area. And so they're not paid professionals, they're friends and neighbors and community members who come together to create the programming. And that's what we call community radio in our public media system. And I don't think the CBC or the BBC have stations like that. That's why it's kind of different, because people assume that all of public radio is NPR in the United States. And actually, it's a very large pool with a very wide spectrum of services they provide. For example, on most Indigenous lands and Native nations, there will be a public radio station licensed to the tribal council. And typically there are paid people running the stations, you know, like a manager, an operations person, a journalist, but there are also dozens and dozens of volunteers from the community that help and come in and help in many ways, both on air and off air. So that is how those tribal nations are tapping into public media service. And what I find among those stations is that one of the key concerns and functions of the radio station is obviously local information, which is very hard to come by if you're not living in a major urban center in the States, and if you're not part of the coastal elite. It's very hard to have local information. And the thing that has really struck me is language preservation is so alive in tribal radio in the United States. So you'll find things like tribal communities picking a word from native tongue and defining it and using it and bringing school children in to talk about it and draw pictures. And this is how they keep their languages alive. It's one of the strongest ways of doing that left. So because you can hear it, right? You can hear it. It's not just looking at it.
Yeah. So who funds it and how is it funded? I mean, is it just citizens contributing or what?
Right. So in the 30s, when radio started taking off like wildfire all over the world, and people could see, oh, this is a powerful warm medium and it's got a lot of potential. Well, of course, in the US, the immediate interest that was on the part of corporations and businesses to run advertising. And it was college professors and academics who got together and said, this is a really valuable resource and medium for education and for culture and art, and we need to preserve the access of that for people so that it's not burdened by advertising. They could read the writing on the wall. So then, you know, they began organizing and working on that in mostly university campuses. But then over time, by 1967, the hallmark legislation is the Public Broadcasting Act. And it was signed into law by President Johnson. And what it did was created a federal pass-through for a taxpayer investment in a public media infrastructure. And what they did was created a nonprofit organization called the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or CPB. And they funded CPB and took some steps to ensure that that CPB would not involve itself in program content, but to be more of an infrastructure support for the entire system. And they would be responsible for equitably and dispersing the funds to qualified stations and holding them accountable to the American people for this investment. So that is how money makes its way to public media stations in the United States, is largely through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And they have, it would take 5 sessions of talking with you to describe how convoluted and confusing the funding metrics are and the criteria, but suffice to say that there's a total of $445 million that the federal government invests in public broadcasting. That number's been the same for years, and just recently it was increased a bit by 50 million for infrastructure repairs. And then right out of the gate, by statute, because of the Public Broadcasting Act, 75% of that money goes to public television, 25% goes to radio. So when you do the math, it ends up being about $100 million into the radio side of public media. And that gets dispersed almost exclusively through a community service grant program. And most of the members of our stations, my organization has 187 community stations who are members, and 65 of them receive these grants. The rest have to do it all on their own.
Right. And in the time that you've been at NFCB, I know that you've been traveling quite extensively around the US. I know this because you write the most amazing reports, which one day I think I have to force you to get published as a little book, because what a story. But what I'd like you to do is to help us understand, those of us who don't live in the US, how, what are the conditions that that most people who are involved in community radio, what are the conditions of the communities? We're talking about indigenous communities,
historically Black colleges.
What's the quality of their life? What is it? What's going on? I mean, what I'm leading to is to say, look, here we are faced with the epidemic, the COVID epidemic, and let's have an understanding of what people are facing, and therefore then we can talk about what the role of community radio might be. So I'm asking you lots of questions, but there we are.
Yeah. Well, okay, so you're referring to an initiative that that I put forward called the Community Counts Initiative. And my thought was really, it was mostly stimulated by a wonderful quote from Albert Einstein, who said, "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts." So it was the idea of, here we are in the age of big data, and what gets lost in the sauce are rural communities, because numbers-wise, they'll never have the kind of impact that we have all this pressure to have when you're in the nonprofit industry. So I wanted to travel to the rural stations and find out. I had developed a strategic framework for decision-making, specifically under conditions of massive change, because anyone in media anywhere in the world knows that the digital age has radically altered the way people use information, consume information, and experience information, as well as music and art. So my quest was to discover where's the creativity and the innovation and the collaboration in rural America around these kinds of things, because typically we really aren't considered part of the picture of American life. There's a romantic notion of it, and there's also a stereotype notion of it, but I wanted to see the real thing. And so 65% of our members are rural stations. So I traveled to 11 states in 2 months' time and spent 2 to 3 days at each of 10 stations who applied to work closely with me in a cohort-based learning experience. And we use this strategic framework model that I call the circle of engagement. And we tried to look at their organizations and see, how can we take existing capacity and optimize their capacity so that they could make steps towards their highest aspirations. And that sounds like it all makes sense, but in classical development speak, most times larger organizations come in with a bucket list of best practices and tell smaller organizations to mimic them, and they don't work. A lot of them don't work. So this was an effort to say, what's happening here? What do you care about? And not starting with the question of, what's your worst need? What's the thing that's really tearing you up? And, what do you need to do to be better? But start with the question of, what do you care about? What do you love about what you do? And how do we move closer to your highest aspirations? And it was transformational, and I was deeply humbled and impressed and inspired by the level of devotion and loyalty and commitment that people have to the places they live. And I have that same feeling about where I live. So I discovered it all over the country. And to your question about conditions, I would say this, that the United States is very good at exporting popular culture via Hollywood and network cable news and that kind of media, pop music, etc. But the picture that is painted is one that reflects a lifestyle of the elites, and mostly coastal elites. And it doesn't, if it taps into something rural, it's usually stereotypical, like people are dim-witted and slow and sloppy, you name it. Those, all the kinds of the same playbook that is used to marginalize communities of color, right? Except that the weird thing that's going on right now, and I think, Firoz, I might be going down a rabbit hole here, so feel free to like, stop that woman. But the really strange thing is that this is a very huge country and it's a vast geography. And the infrastructure that's required, for example, for a public health system to be robust in a time of a pandemic was intended and was constructed after the Great Depression, but it has been eviscerated in terms of funding over 40 years under both Democrats and Republicans. So what's going on in rural communities across the board is they're being hit really hard by mental health issues, for one. I mean, we're all talking about social distancing and social isolation. Well, most people live in rural areas because they want to be isolated socially, but it also has a cost in terms of your mental health. So suicide rates, for example, in the county where I live, are 10 times higher than the rest of the state.
Wow.
And domestic violence rates, the methamphetamine affliction that we have experienced has hit rural areas very hard because it's really cheap. And people are suffering with lack of opportunity. So most of the jobs are low paying and not creative or particularly rewarding. So there's a whole perfect storm that has happened with this pandemic that, in my view, includes declining sort of quality of public education of that institution, a real decline in our commitment to public health. We've overinvested in specialties and highly equipped hospitals for the well-insured, and we've underinvested pathetically in general care and wellness care. And so you have populations of people who are already marginalized and disadvantaged economically with a very strained infrastructure that was already near the breaking point. And so the assumption that we have these robust infrastructure to respond to this is wrong. The infrastructure that we have that is really robust is the United States military. That's where our money's gone.
Right. I mean, you put out a statement to your members, explaining to them how to deal with the COVID virus, about washing hands properly, alcohol, social distancing, and so on. But I'm just trying to envisage, for example, amongst the indigenous communities, etc., where some of them I visited have hardly anything you would call housing, and what does it mean? What are these kind of recommendations that the government is putting out, that everyone is putting out, about being safe? What does it mean for those communities? What kind of risk are they facing in a situation where it is not possible to be separate, different from each other, keeping us away from each other,
right?
Access to water and soap and so on.
Well, I listened intently to your interview yesterday with Alex from Brazil, and her point about the Brazil being founded on genocide is the same for the United States. So I would imagine most Indigenous people in the United States know quite well what pandemics can do, because after all, it was the US cavalry that infected saddle blankets and other trade goods with smallpox epidemics as a strategy to wipe them out.
Yeah.
So this is not surprising, nor is it, the level of suffering and the fact that it's marginalized communities and lower income families that are harder hit by these kinds of things is absolutely no surprise whatsoever to communities of color in the United States, because they've lived that with their blood, sweat, and tears for decades and decades. So I think that one thing that is, I know it's a calming feeling for me, is that most native lands or reservations, I don't like to use that word, but most native lands are not densely populated. And so you do have at least the psychological comfort of knowing you're not in a very high density thing like people in New Rochelle in New York City right now. I mean, that to me, and maybe this is just because I've lived in rural areas my whole life, but that to me would be a recipe for a panic attack, because how do you keep from interacting or how do you keep from encountering droplets from people when there's thousands of them in a small vicinity? So I think there is that going for all of us in these more sparsely populated areas. But in terms of hygiene and sanitation and safety, the biggest obstacle is running water and being able to wash your hands and do that kind of thing. People just assume that everyone's got that, and that's not true. So I think of the Navajo reservation, which is closest to me, is huge. It's vast landscape, and many traditional dwellings of Hogans are set up for carrying water. It's chop wood, carry water. And there are many back to the land kind of counterculture United States citizens who live that same way by choice in rural America. So I think that's a very real issue. And particularly with community radio, when you have so many people coming in to help create the programming, most of these stations have restructured in the last 10 days to where they're not open to the public. It's just a small staff trying to keep programming going. And they're working very hard to figure out how to create remote programming from someone's home that can be put in a Dropbox and then aired on the airwaves, so that they can still have the participation and engagement of the community without involving people in sharing one space. So that's, and then of course, once you were to test positive for it, what happens is that we have not as many hospital beds, not as many physicians, very few ventilators. It's all about, when you have healthcare for profit, the way to make profit in that, of course, is to have, dense populations that are all tapping into you. And so what suffers is the larger infrastructure for the entire country. And that's true with everything. I mean, it's true with electricity, with emergency medical services, hospitals, et cetera. So, this whole push to flatten the curve is about trying to not overwhelm the hospitals. And that remains to be seen.
Right. But one of the things about crises is that it also stimulates not just the fear but the creativity, and I can imagine that amongst the community radio stations there must be examples of this kind of creativity going on. Can you perhaps speak to
So I'm smiling because it's the source of all my passion for this work, right? I mean, radio at the end of the day is performance art. And whether it's information you're imparting or a song or a thought or a poem, it's a warm medium. It goes from the heart to the heart. You can hear in the human voice when someone is about to cry or laugh, or what kinds of subtle emotions are going on. And what I love about it is that you don't have the visual right in front of your face. You get to imagine. So it's always, radio has always been a handmaiden to creativity and to celebrate and lift the human spirit. And in fact, when I was talking about President Johnson, one of the things he said in his speech when he signed the Public Communications Act was that people are hungry for more than a chicken in every pot. I mean, that's a basic human need. We all know that. But we also hunger for connection, and we also hunger for excellence, and we also hunger to lift our spirits. And so that's a role that these community stations are playing right now. And I keep reminding them, impart the information, practice the best safety protocols you can to keep yourself well and safe. Try and give people the resources that they need to be able to address hunger. We've got lots of children going hungry right now in the United States in this lockdown because there's no food at home. They were getting it at school. So there's that whole arena of things that are very, very important, but also lift people's spirit. And I think that that's what a lot of stations are doing. So I gave you the example when we were speaking before of quarantine haikus are a contest that one radio station is doing. They're opening their airways for concerts of local musicians who now have nowhere to play and no income coming in from doing that. So it's expanding people's exposure to emerging artists. There are people taking to the airwaves and reading stories for children and engaging in history lessons and other kinds of things, instruction for parents who are at home with kids and trying to work. And also for our elders, for telling, reading aloud and telling stories and helping to provide comfort to our elders who are often, confused and very scared about what's going on and already feeling isolated. So these are just myriad ways that these community stations step up. And it'll be things like, okay, I just heard an announcement this morning that someone was coming from the San Luis Valley, which is another agricultural area to the east of us, with a load of potatoes. And if people wanted potatoes, to meet them on Main Street in Hotchkiss, and they would be distributing potatoes. And so this is how people are getting information for, how to navigate this environment that has left them with food shortages and a lot of fear and panic and potentially, medical shortages as well.
Yeah, I mean, what comes across to me, it's quite remarkable, is that this community radio station provides a basis for intra-community, within the community solidarity. But
Right.
your organization also connects these community radio stations together. So there is a transnational solidarity potential there. And I just wonder, to what extent is that solidarity network something that could play a potential role in organizing under conditions in the times of the epidemic?
Well, I think this could be communities radio's finest hour in that way. And I believe that because, for one thing, it's economical to use radio in these times. It's also safe in terms of distance and getting people to be able to connect. And then already community radio stations have shifted dramatically in the age of the internet, where you can listen to anything you want at any time, Google any factoid at any time if you have access to internet. It has started to take on the role of helping to curate collections of thoughts and ideas and stories for people who don't have time to do that, and also to discover new music and emerging artists, and also to convene community conversations. So you've seen community radio stations go out and do things like story circles are a real big deal. And we go around to different towns that we're serving, and people come and share their stories, and we tape those and edit them and then air them to a larger audience, which allows people to hear something of themselves in the broader media picture, which is really rare and wonderful if you are a member of community of color or a rural community, because so often your experiences are not reflected in the mainstream. So it serves as a connecting point. I think your question reminds me of the Utah writer Terry Tempest Williams, who's one of my very favorites, a naturalist, and she was mentored by Wallace Stegner, who wrote the Wilderness Act. And she's a poet and a writer. And she said that when she met Wallace Stegner and they were talking about wilderness and, the notion that in wilderness lies the preservation of the soul, is what Thoreau had to say about it. But she wrote that art is a form of open space whose very purpose is to disturb, disrupt, and bring us to tenderness. So I think the call of community radio is to disturb and disrupt and bring people to tenderness. And it is only in finding that within ourselves that we'll find the courage to proceed in the face of this intense vulnerability to try and be better human beings on this planet.
Wow, that is really beautiful, Sally. Just one final point. I mean, I'd love to speak about this all day. But one final point. I mean, maybe I'm being naive or optimistic, you're coming up to the presidential elections in the USA, and under conditions where rallies, public meetings, etc., are not possible. What are the potentials for community radio to provide a space for that debate, for that discussion, for that public discussion, in a way that perhaps other media are not really able to provide? And indeed, this might be, I don't know, maybe being naive, an advantage now.
It's not naive at all. I think it's very astute. I think this is our advantage. And just like right now, folks who live in rural areas have in some way an advantage by being able to have some space around them with social distancing. It's the same with community radio right now. And my hope, and what I am, working hard to try and support and encourage, is for radio stations to take it on in terms of interviewing people who are running for office and figuring out what's happening in their local communities around this election, how people are organizing, what their thoughts are, and sharing those over the airwaves. The other thing about radio is that we have, the sky's the limit as far as live programming goes. For people to call into the station and be patched through onto the air is just the push of a button. So you could literally have people running for office who are being interviewed by the citizenry live on the radio, and people can hear that and share in that. And I think that's a really, really important thing. What we see so much right now is that, social media, and much of what we call media now is really social media and network news. Those are rife. Those sources are rife with misinformation. And in this pandemic, it's been really, really disturbing to see that our president's press conferences are loaded with misinformation, and they're being just aired by the networks, right? So the community radio stations have a sacred obligation to be alert and vigilant and to call that out. And you saw with KUOW in Seattle that community station, which is licensed to a university, actually, University of Washington, said, we're not airing those press conferences because they're actually a danger to the citizenry. Because when you
Brilliant.
have someone stand up telling you that you should maybe be taking a medicine that could kill you, that's for another disease, malaria, and people are getting, heart arrhythmias from this stuff, then you as a broadcaster have a responsibility for having passed that on. It's like yelling fire in a locked or crowded building, So this is where community radio stations have not just an opportunity, but a sacred obligation.
Right. Yeah, I'm Sally. I mean, as one of our watchers said, this is really inspiring. It's just amazing to hear from you.
Good. We need
Really,
it.
we appreciate your giving time to participate. I just wonder whether you might want to say a few words to people who are viewing or will be viewing this. What can they do to support not just NFCB, but what can they do to support community radio stations? What are the opportunities for encouraging that organizing that people could get directly involved?
So one thing that community radio stations would love to have is shared content with other community radio stations in other countries. And I think because of the technology, we can go direct for that now. We don't have to wait for CBC or BBC or NPR to decide they want to do a story on a small radio station somewhere. We can connect ourselves. And I would recommend that people who are listening or are watching, please reach out to NFCB. And Feroz, perhaps you can make that contact, but it's nfcb.org. And to me, and what I would love to see is I envision sister radio stations, and some of our stations do that, where you connect with a station. Say you're in rural agricultural Colorado, and I want to connect with a station in an agrarian community in Portugal. We can do that. We can exchange the information and the content and talk to one another, just in the same way that you can get 5 farmers in my community on the radio every Tuesday evening. Our show, the garden show, is called As the Worm Turns. And it's wonderful information about, pruning things and what this master gardener is doing in his garden any time of the year, Lance, who grows all of his own food and teaches all of us how to save seeds and how to grow things. If we can get 5 farmers in the room to talk about that every Tuesday, why couldn't a group of community radio stations connect with 100 agrarian people around the world to talk about some of these things? And why can't we be the experts? Why are we waiting for the experts? We who are having these lived experiences with the land and with one another, we do not need to wait for experts to tell us what that lived experience is. We simply need to communicate it.
Yeah, absolutely. What I would be really interested in from you is perhaps connection with some of the Indigenous radio stations to hear from them. I'd love to involve them in a discussion. But this has been really great, Sally. Thank you so much. It's been really inspiring. Thank you, and I look forward to our connections again.
Wonderful. Thank you, Feroz.
Okay.
Be well.
And you. That was Sally Kane from Colorado. I think really inspiring session. And opens up the whole idea of the potential of community radios for communities to take the initiative directly to build their own ways of organizing and not necessarily be so dependent on a centralized federal state. So thank you all for watching today. And we will be broadcasting again. I think our next show is on Tuesday. I'll publish our information about that. It's from a discussion with an Algerian activist about uprisings in the times of COVID. This is Firoz Manji signing off. Thanks very much for joining us.